Live streaming is on. We're on.
All right.
And now cyber humans to human beings is on. So that's awesome. Okay, there we go. Okay, we're ready to rock. I don't know if you wanted to start with the I've made like a weekly meeting notes and also like the document too for this thing. And I have this Jamboard open if we need to reference anything, but I didn't add anything special to it.
Okay.
Besides this amazing chapter slide. Here we go. Ready to go.
We can. Sorry, can you hear the sirens in the background?
That's fine.
I did, but it's not oppressive.
Okay. I guess so. My first thought is, I kind of wish I had found the other PDF, for the first edition.
Oh, really? Yeah.
I guess so. This isn't necessarily in response to the first chapter, but I went back and reread the introduction after last week, and the way that the introducer talks about it makes it sound like the first version of the book was a little bit punchier, maybe.
Yeah.
And there are also, it sounds like there were pros to this version as well. Like it was a bit more polished. And now that I think I chose this one for a reason. But yeah, I liked that part of the introduction.
What was punchy about it, I wonder?
Right. The bluntness and pungency.
Oh.
Norbert, I think Norbert was a little bit more unbridled in criticizing, some of the politics of the time. And also, what else did it say here? There's another one here. I don't know if his yeah, maybe this here like
It's like he was really into a lot of stuff.
I think he felt I'm trying to remember what was said about like the McCarthyism stuff. Like I think he was sort of I think McCarthyism might have tempered his outputs. Does that sound right? Like he wanted to kind of be a little bit more sterile in the sense of just wanting to get his message out and not. I think unfiltered Norbert would be like pointing out all like everything that we now criticize in the era of that time period. You kind of had to be an American and kind of okay, well we're not communist, and it was all that critique of stuff where it's like you got to be on board, and I think unfiltered Norbert would be a lot more. I could be on camera for a second here. I think unfiltered Norbert would be a lot more like, kind of unabashedly saying the way things are going in certain areas is not good. And I'm curious. What I'm curious also is sort of like, was he also more critical of like? I wonder how critical he was of the Cognitive Science Project, and if that was something that he spoke out. I don't think that changed as much as like the political stuff. Well, I think this is more the in the introduction or the forward, the not Norbert Weiner. I think it was like Heinz or something. Stephen somebody wrote more. I think the author was more dragging Cogsci out right than Norbert was. But I'm curious if you have any thoughts about that, Amanda, or what else you want to say about the introduction. I'm just kind of remembering on the fly. I wasn't prepared to talk about this stuff, so I'm kind of reviewing my stuff.
I don't have thoughts about the introduction. much
Okay.
more than what I said. I guess on the note of cog-sci and the continuity between cybernetics and cog-sci, I thought that this first chapter was illuminating when it came to like showing the beginning of the computer brain metaphor, the generally computational view of the mind, and like an early version of that. I thought that this really, I don't know, helped me think in more detail about the metaphor, the mind-computer metaphor, because it was, I think just because of the point in history and the state of computer science at that time. I just found it very illustrative. And I also sorry, go ahead.
This thing, you can finish your thought, but I'll come back to this later.
No, I like this quote a lot. Thank you for pulling it up. Yeah, because also in this first chapter, you can see the areas of like divergence between man and machine. Maybe there's not much that he says explicitly about the difference, because right now he's trying to motivate, the parallels, and he's motivating cybernetics as like this more fundamental conceptual framework. But even just the way he's describing the parallels, like, prompts you to think about the differences. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just reminded of like this. I don't even know when I made this. I made this like in 2017, 18, 16, I don't know. And then I put it on Figshare.
Oh, nice.
Because I not because it's really a citable thing, just because I wanted to. It was something I know I could remember, because I would always come back and reference this specific quote, and was like, yeah, okay. So I threw it on here as a reference point, and it's probably somewhere in all the GitHub files that we have. But this, I don't know how to really compare it to this outside of some really just general, it stands in opposition to some of the heavy cognitivist brain to computer stuff. But I always liked the quote, and I think it's from the original. It's just a subsection in the original cybernetics, I believe. But I always thought it was like there was so much context in this quote that I feel like, man, I wish people talking about, and this is even like before all the GTP stuff, like when I first saw it in like the late 2010s, and then obviously I guess I put this in here in 2020, which is like my second year in the lab here, basically. But it was just the context of just, it's weird. It'll be really interesting as a total side note, and I don't want to go on. We can go right into chapter 1 after this. I don't want to go so far, but like as a we're kind of talking about in the reading group, these sort of like these potential papers we could do with like these driving questions. I feel like a subset of like the greatest hits in cognitive science thing, or like a really specific thing, would be, how is it that like in modern well, is maybe I don't know how to phrase it, but my question is basically, because even actually, I think I can, yeah, I'm gonna mention this. This will be a fun juxtaposition. Hussein posted this, which was, because it was called artificial intelligence, we're now forced into debating whether LLMs are conscious or sentient or so on. And I liked your response to it, in that there are questions, and these are, I like your response as well. I think to try to be charitable to what this was talking about was like, even in this first chapter, Norbert, he spent a decent amount of time. I'm trying to figure out where it was. I think it's more like maybe around here, like 26 or something. He's very careful about talking about. Oh, I don't mean to say that. Might have been a little bit sooner. I don't recall exactly. And like he was very careful differentiating. I don't. He said something like, "I don't mean to say that the certain." Well, that conversation he had about like vitalism and life. Like, remember that part of the chapter? I don't remember where that was, but it kind of reminds me of that. I don't know if I can search for it here.
I don't remember the word vitalism.
Yeah, here we go. If we use the word life to cover all the phenomena which locally swim upstream against the current of increasing entropy, we're at liberty to do so. However, we then shall include many astronomical phenomena which have only the shadiest resemblance to life as we ordinarily know it. It is, in my opinion, therefore, best to avoid all question-begging epithets such as life, soul, vitalism, and the like, and say merely in connection with machines that there's no reason why they may not resemble human beings and representing so on and so forth. When I compare the organism to this machine, I do not for a moment mean that the specific physical chemical cellular processes are the same as life-imitating machines. I simply mean that it both can exemplify local anti-entropic processes, which is perhaps maybe also exemplified, and so on. So basically, he has a lot of care about this differentiation, and I think this. I don't know if I agree with Mr. Gunkel about that. That it would just be easier because I don't think it would be necessarily kind of like you said, but I respect, including a Humpty Dumpty reference. Norbert's between that and his quote, there's sort of a healthy. I really liked his he was getting. I didn't finish all this certain part, but he was getting into like Mephistopheles and the different demons and Saint Augustine and like all these different takes on the devils and demons. It was like, wow, that's cool.
Yeah. You read ahead. That's chapter 2.
I did.
So I didn't get there yet.
Oh, I was actually listening. So I'm going to out myself for. I'm always behind. As you know, I'm always behind the readings. But somehow I made myself go on a bike ride, and I just listened on the audio version of it, and I didn't I was like, oh shit, like I couldn't tell where the chapter was ending, so I guess I did go much further. Is this in chapter 2 that I'm even referencing?
Yeah, it's not too much further.
Wow. That's how much I've expected I wouldn't get far ahead. Well, okay, so I totally digress now, but anyway.
No, that's a perfect preview because he did. Chapter 1 was mostly pointing to the parallels between man and machine. So at the end of chapter 1, he summarizes and says, "It is my thesis that the physical functioning of the living individual and the operation of some of the newer communication machines are precisely parallel in their analogous attempts to control entropy through feedback." So, and then he talks about sense perception. I liked the way that he said that, these windows to the world that machines have, even if it's like a photoelectric cell, I like that he called those sense organs, because it's like that kind of strong analogy or metaphor between a living creature and machine. I think that is very explanatory, and that's like what he's getting at in chapter 2, it seems, too. Well, I guess chapter 1 is about how explanatory this framework is, and then chapter 2, that bit that you read, talks about the limits of that metaphor. Like even if cybernetics helps us make sense of the mechanisms of life, in a lot of aspects of the operations of living creatures, it still doesn't allow a definition of life, I guess, in a sense. There's still more, and that more doesn't have to be anything mysterious, but
Yeah. So in the DivaWorm meeting on Monday, we do the meeting and then I do a feature at the end, and it's usually just me talking about some references. I covered a bunch of stuff on what they call assembly theory, which is how did life start? So, the idea is that life started by assembling things and putting them in order. And then there's this transition from non-life to life. So, the question is what is living, what is non-living, and how do we define that transition? And one of the things they use an index, which just kind of counts the parts that are there, and then if they're functional and something. Actually, the way they do the analysis is something's alive, something's not alive. So if it's a rock, it's not alive. If it's a tree, it's alive. If it's a human, it's alive. If it's a crystal, it's maybe kind of at the border of life. But the point is you can use this index, and the index is higher for things that are living versus not. So I kind of throw that in there because it's sort of like maybe an alternative to the cybernetic view, where it's to say that if we have assembly theory, which is that parts assemble into this thing that's eventually living, what is the cybernetic regulation of that process? I mean, could we explain that through cybernetics? And so, the thing that Jesse talked about before about local anti-entropic processes. So what are those? It seems important for the origin of life, and it seems important for some of the stuff with sense organs serving as a window to the world, and sort of providing an input to that the sort of entropic forces of a living system.
Well, but I most remember. Go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say you need a third von Forster demon for the sense organs.
Yeah.
That's what I was basically going to go towards. I was make a joke about the forces are these little small demons that stand in doorways and make molecules and atoms. That's the easy.
It's the order from noise. That's actually probably very relevant for this. What'd you say? Assembly theory?
Assembly theory, yeah.
So if a self-organizing system can take disorganized raw energy from the world and turn it into something with order, then obviously you have to explain how that happens. But I do really like the von Forster demons metaphor. I think I like the distinction it helped me form in my mind between operations going on within the self-organizing system, and then operations going on between that system and the environment.
Yeah.
There's some stuff phoning my ever-present Avery Angel, which kind of reminds what ever-present Avery Angel reminds me of Everything Everywhere All at Once a little bit, which is something that a movie we both watched and I've commented on in different ways. Also, just point that out there for posterity. Avery and I have had a lot of theoretical discussions about one of the things Avery does in a lot of the research and thoughts are sort of trying to tease apart these spectrums or sort of dichotomies and where things fit in terms of almost like a polarity or a it's like these sort of explorations into a zone of operation, and then okay, what's the sort of, it's almost like an inverted kind of triangulation where you kind of, it's like kind of like a sonar, like you start at a point and see what reflects from hitting that point with like a sonar kind of a thing. And it'd be really interesting to kind of combine their continued sort of work in this, and then some of their and mine previous like pseudoscientific investigations into why I'm saying this is mostly kind of for myself. If I look back on this in the future, where what we just talked about, I think goes into some of our information processing related theories of old, not ours, but when we were caring about those pseudo theories, and how some of the information elements within them were sort of I just drew a diagram on one of my other whiteboards that I'm not going to show or can't really get at easily right now, where it's like that same kind of distance from certain poles, or a point and then the two poles from it, and how that affects this talk of demons, and then Amanda's comment on the third demon incorporating sense organs kind of a thing. I think there's something there that would come out if we gave it a lot of attention. So anyway, I'm going to kind of recenter back on this. I don't know if you want to start from like the start of the chapter or where you want to go next, Amanda. I'll defer to you.
We don't have to. We can just jump around. I don't know if there are any other particular passages that I want to reference. I liked that. Well, I guess one thing I didn't like was I felt like there could have been a lot more explaining of what he's talking about. Just like he'd mention an idea and it would be so fast, or he'd like name drop someone, and maybe like the people reading this book at the time would have recognized what he was talking about. Maybe they're like, I mean, I recognize the names like Pascal
like
at one point,
and yeah, that kind of stuff.
So a lot of name dropping, a lot of referencing these really big ideas, and I know he's trying to make these high level connections, and I know he's not trying to like explain all the details to us, but I would have liked more explanation of the details, because I felt like at times the details are relevant to the connections he's trying to make. And I felt like I would have a better understanding of what he's saying if I had more reference points. But I mean, now I have a reading list. Yeah, for right in particular, I was like, yeah, I like have a sense of all these ideas, but tell me about them.
Yeah, this was like, boy, like you just know, like if I could have like Doctor Strange powers or like something, and like go back and take you all with me right here, and like I don't know, 100 years ago or so, or maybe more like 80 or something, and go across the river to MIT, where Norbert Weiner would do his Wiener walks. He would walk around and talk to people, I guess, kind of like what I try to do. Not that I'm trying to emulate him too hard or anything, but you know, like I would love to, like, like this could be like a 2, 3, 4 hour discussion. Like, what do you mean by all this stuff? And he would just like cite stuff and reference this, and it would be really cool. Like, I don't know if he talks about it elsewhere, but I wonder if we could like chat GTP or like a Norbert bot, and like make like Levin bot like Norbert bot, and like get him to reference stuff, because his dad was super into all these literature people, and I think he was like a literature writer person or something like that, and so he's got all these things here, and never went into math, but like he's got all these like humanitarian classics in some of his training to reference, and then the physics stuff too. Like I get some of the things about, I know who Leibniz is, I get some of his stuff, I understood a little bit about that from past stuff, but like this here I don't know a lot about. I was excited to hear Maxwell go into his own Maxwell's, demons and stuff like that. and even Einstein, like this all this like it's like this sort of in a couple pages he carves as like Einstein, Gibbs, and Newton, and Maxwell, and I was like, okay. So yeah, I relate to that sort of a lot there.
Well, at the
I
end of
did
the
appreciate.
page that you had on the screen. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Nope, I'll get to that later. This one here, you're saying?
Yeah. So this is one point where I like actually really wished for more explanation. The end of 20 and the beginning of 22, about what entropy has to do with 20, end of 21. Sorry, end of 20, top of 21.
Okay, yeah.
The details of Gibbsian mechanics. I felt at the end of our last discussion that I had a okay idea of what contingency was, and then I felt like my grasp had weakened at this part. A certain set of possible outside worlds.
Yeah. Now, just want to be clear, Gibbsian is not the same as Gibsonian here.
That's
Gibbs
right.
is separate, right?
Gibbs was a physicist. He did this thing called Gibbs free energy, which was linked to his views on entropy. I think the way to explain this, I mean, it's not that different from what we were talking about last week. It's like a system will take, like if you have an initial system of a system, it can take any path it wants. And then as you evolve, the system evolves and it makes a decision. It gets restricted to a subset of outcomes. Like for example, in your life when you're born, theoretically you have all different paths available to you. Although that's not really true, but you make a decision, and based on that decision, one set of choices, you're kind of locked into those, as opposed to maybe another set of choices, which would have been possible if you made the other decision. So if you think about it as a decision tree, where each time you make a decision, you restrict your available space forward. So, eventually you'll come to a point where you have, limited options. But that's if that space doesn't grow any, you'll eventually make enough decisions so that you come down to like a single place. And that's okay.
If they want to use the board to draw, you can do that.
But yeah, I mean, it's like in Gibbsian mechanics, I think we have this idea. Quantity which belongs not to the outside world as such, but to certain sets of the possible outside worlds, and therefore to answer the certain specific questions which we can ask concerning the outside world. Physics now becomes not the discussion of the outside universe, but as an account of the answers to much more limited questions. So the outside world has all these states. You sample from those states through your sensory organs. You get, based on your sensory organs, you get a certain set of those possibilities, and you act on them, and that restricts your possibilities more. And I guess that's what he's saying, because the language is really circuitous. If you've noticed, it's like, okay, you could have said this more cleanly, but okay.
That helps, definitely. It was the jump to the language, or it felt like a jump to me from that language to the talk of messages. But reading it again, I that was very helpful, Bradley, and I think I have a better grasp of it now. The theory of much more specific outgoing and incoming messages. So it's more, I almost said contingent, but yeah.
Interesting that he's talking about messages. I guess in cybernetics that's important because you had Shannon working on telegraph wires and messages there, like you're sending messages, there's an information content. So I have messages from like communication or generally, and then of course there's you have the idea of the medium as the message from Marshall McLuhan, which is actually comes around about this time. And, the idea that you have a message, but the medium, depending on the medium, it's different. So you have like different types of media, like, print words and radio and television and VR, and they have different temperatures. So like the more interactive it is, the higher the temperature. And so it's the same message, but it's presented in a different way. And so I think there's a interesting thing here with messages and information, and that is kind of assumed in a lot of this. But
yeah, in my mind, when I was hearing this earlier, I was thinking like basically what Amanda said, and how like there was this transition from a lot of like physics stuff, and then there's a certain point where I think this is it for me too. As I remember this paragraph, and it's like he talks about Einstein making abundant the observer made at rest or moving, and then he goes, yeah, it kind of introduces this sort of, I don't know what, the observer comes into it, like how the observer comes into this discussion was interesting, and I know we just talked about it, but I'm still kind of processing it.
The medium is the message idea is really interesting, and that is maybe the beginning of it. Although I think Weiner would agree that, so the part that I put in the notes there, when I give an order to a machine, the situation is not essentially different from that which arises when I give an order to a person. And then he explains what he means, and it's kind of like obviously true. But I know he's not getting at like anything much. It doesn't follow from that like man is machine. So why? And I think that there's always context to the message. And so the context when you like the message, so maybe sure, the situation is not essentially different no matter what you're giving a message to, but the content of that message will obviously differ. And then like between giving a message to man and to machine, because you're aware of the identity of the recipient of your message, and the message will be catered to that. And then the ability of the medium to be constitutive of the message maybe is something that differs for man and machine here. Basically, I was trying to think of specific ways that there are specific areas of divergence between this message giving and receiving. Between living things and non-living things.
So like here in 16, he says, let's see. Okay, that's where you're talking about. So then he goes into, in other words, as far as my consciousness goes, I'm aware of the order. Oh, you're going to move it too far. That has gone out and of the signal of compliance that has come back. So there he talks about a signal of compliance, which is an order. So an order is carried on a signal. And then a signal, of course, is a symbol, if you think about it that way, or it's just basically like a carrier wave or a telegraph line or whatever. And then to me personally, the fact that the signal is in its intermediate stages has gone through a machine rather than through a person. This is irrelevant and does not cause greatly change my relation to the signal. So that's actually different from McLuhan, because McLuhan would say, well, if you have something on a carrier wave versus, in a three-dimensional environment, that's a little bit different. The order maybe changes, at least in terms of its nature, in terms of how it's interpreted. Thus, the theory of control and engineering, whether human or animal or mechanical, is a chapter in the theory of messages. Okay.
So yeah, in one sense, like that's true.
How do you spell McLuhan? Yes.
MCLUHAN. Go ahead, Amanda.
I guess so. I think he's right that the fact that the signal in its intermediate stages has gone through a machine rather than through a person is irrelevant to the sender's relation to the signal. But it is not irrelevant to what the signal is. It's not relevant to how the recipient will respond. There's a lot that it is that whether or not it's a man or a machine, there's a lot where that is relevant. A lot of steps in this process where that makes a huge difference. And so, yeah, I guess I was trying to think about the particular differences that could cause. And yeah, one would be the content of the signal. I don't know. I guess I'm skeptical of, so if what he says here is true, it's very, very limited. So he's going to have to say a lot more to explain how cybernetics explains more complicated human processes.
Right.
Yeah, but interesting to kind of compare that. Like he's saying, what granularity is he talking about this versus like this? Like he's making very clear differences here at the operational level.
And one thing I like about that quote is that it's still talking about humans in terms of computers. It's just the difference between man and machine can be described in computational terms, I guess. Cybernetic terms.
Yeah.
It is the purpose of cybernetics to develop a language and a technique that will enable us to indeed attack the problems of control and communication in general, but also find the proper repertory of ideas and techniques to classify their particular manifestations under certain concepts. I wonder what he, like, by concepts, I don't know if he says it later on here, but like, would that also be like mediums or circumstances or?
I read concepts there as, I mean, maybe because he starts off talking about like the language of cybernetics. I thought of concepts as things like feedback, open system, closed system, and then hopefully that dictionary of terms contains within it the ability to like tease apart the important differences, like between a bunch of cases of like positive feedback or something. Like even when you get to a very specific description in cybernetic terms, like a open system with, I mean, I don't know enough systems theory, but like with all the technical specifications, you describe a system really, really in a lot of detail, but the goal is to still have the language to identify where there could be differences between two things that fall into that category. So maybe a living thing and a non-living thing have all of these things in common. They can be described in all of these same ways, but you also need to have the language to distinguish between them.
There's somewhere in here, and I don't know where, and I almost don't even want to mention it because when I go into it, I want to go into it more, but I'm just gonna like mention it and not really talk about it. There's continuously circling my mind around all this stuff is every good regulator theorem, and like what is it, what even that thing on, I don't know if I'm just gonna go here. Sure. Yeah, here we go. Like this discussion about the regulator theorem here, as in internal models or predictions, but also this comment that it's like the internal model to be explicit, and it's like, is how true, like what does that necessarily mean? Because there's sort of these different degrees of explicitness or relevance, and I'm not like whoops, well, I'll keep this here, but like I don't feel like, I guess what I was saying is a bit of, there's some relationship to like the every good regular theorem, the control, the amount of explicitness, and also sort of like the requisite, I don't really like using this word, what like the requisite affordances, or I think what Amanda was saying maybe says it better, but like the ability of the medium to be constitutive of the message. I think there's something with all of those things that's I'm curious. I'm really curious about I'm sure Norbert's thought about that and probably wrote a lot about it, and I don't know what he's thought about it. So we'll put it that way.
That's an interesting tweet, because that's a good example of what we were talking about, because it's like this like the cybernetic language gives us this theorem, but I guess a better version of that tweet would like, what does explicit mean? That seems like it's from the dictionary of whatever philosophy this guy's doing, like and also internal model. Well, maybe the regulator theorem says more about that, but it's like you want, and I think this is what cybernetic language has, is you want to be able to like, I don't know, just be precise. Maybe that's really all I mean, is like you need precision. So the good regulator theorem says XYZ, but it also explicitly does not say, ABC. It doesn't say that the internal model needs to be explicit or whatever that means. But it gives you further language to like create new subcategories. And tease apart different phenomena.
And that this like, there's a very unpleasant familiarity about this that like is really, I wish I could explain. I wish I could just sort of stop this and elaborate for a few minutes, and I don't want to, on like hearing that and thinking about literally staring at Notion right now, which is this thing in which I make categories and relationships within categories and relate it to it and think about, I have to create a space for the category, and Notions, I can flexibly move that or not. Also, there's this other article I've been reading about, just to mention this, like grass and its ability to laterally transfer DNA, which is sort of an interesting biological thing that I was supposed to put in Diva Worm.
Horizontal gene transfer?
Yeah. Horizontal. And it, unrelated to this, but like this talk about just like I have this very powerful emotional response to everything we're talking about while I'm staring at a Notion and its database stuff. But we can go back to
actually
to what you're saying. Yeah.
Do you have Twitter open? Can
Yeah.
you search for Maxim Roginski? You know who that is?
I think I follow him. Yeah.
Okay, pull up his feed. I want to see something. I want to show you something he said today, I think. R-A-G.
Roginski. There we go.
There
Man, Twitter Twitter, you are not good about how you. I hate that they prioritize all this stuff in the people I follow. Anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, this one here. Yeah. I would like to propose a complete and total shutdown of the use of control theoretic metaphors by philosophers of mind until they figure out what the hell is going on by reading post-1960s control theory literature. And then he recommends feedback and control for everyone. I mean, this is kind of like, I guess 1960s would be like cybernetic or something. But it's kind of interesting that language, has been evolving in control theory, sometimes to the extent that it's very hard to understand by like non-engineers. And so I just, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. This would be interesting to see like what are the new terms that people are coming up with for some of these things. How are they refining that vocabulary?
There's a very implicit in all of this is sort of this, and what I'm really curious how Norbert gets into this, because this is almost like what I'm going to try to say and not say very well, is this sort of like, I want to say not meta commentary or meta cybernetics. Maybe meta cybernetics is a fine term, but I actually think literally meta Norbert, in like Norbert commenting on the point, Norbert explaining more about his idea of human use of human beings and cybernetics, saying like Norbert's, what he's not saying here is like there's an inherent, not just in doing cybernetics right. Let's go back to this quote. In doing cybernetics right, the language, like to me, and I'm thinking a lot from the mentoring stuff and a lot of my own shit here, so like bear with me. But implicit in this is developing a language and techniques, but also bringing the observer or the practitioner or the user along into making the space where they're understanding the constitutive requirements, where they're making, it's sort of, there's sort of a relationship to affordance, perception, and awareness itself, which is again kind of meditating out a little too much, but I'm.
So what would be the role of affordances in control, do you think?
In a pedagogical sense, or in a specifically a system, or?
Well, yeah, any system. If you had an affordance and it was involved in control, what would be the thing? How would that work? Like, say, if I had like a road sign, or maybe like the handle of a fork or something. How does that help me in control?
Whenever I try to connect affordance talk to systems theory talk, I think of Shimero's, the way he writes about coupling and synergies, and like tool use. I think of physical tool use as a good example of tool use is what is like afforded by an environment that contains tools. The affordance of like a tool offers an affordance if it's like able to be used by the subject, and that use involves coupling. That's, I know I'm not explaining it well, but I feel like that helps me connect the dots between affordance talk and systems theory talk. And I know that doesn't get us all the way to like feedback and messages.
but there is I see what you're saying, and this I'm kind of tangentially going here, but I think what you're saying, like there is an inherent and sort of Norbertian and Wienerian, how do we go to this? In the way Norbert might say it, there's a temporary but functionally effectual relevant coupling of the situation, the dance. It's the dance. Like, okay, we're dancing right now. Like, okay, the song's on, the music's playing, we know the steps, we want to do it, we're doing it, we're dancing, it's happening, and okay, then it's over. There's something about that space that seems to affect in the context of it, which is sort of ad hoc, or at least on a very specific time scale. Like I kind of would like to, like, I know he talks about, I think in this chapter he talks about like the what is it here, the music box, and the music box has a very specific pattern, and there's not really deviation from the pattern. It doesn't really matter what happens in the past, but like there's sort of this, within this thing there is opportunities, and it's this weird, like, so I'm not ready to go there yet, but there's sort of my whole commentary about the emotional response to notion itself is sort of like there's sort of different baselines of homeostatic regulation, like, and perception. And I really wonder if he gets into something about does Norbert ever talk about, and I don't know if like Norbert or other people, I kind of mentioned Bradley or Alicia or Amanda, if you know like other philosophers in this area talking about this, like what's the relationship? It's almost sort of like taking Chimero stuff and flipping it a little bit of like, what's the relationship between the amount of homeostatic stability necessary by which other things can be built sort of in its wake or in its presence? Like there's there. I just keep thinking of the Notion analogy of like, okay, Notion has this kind of defined set of rules about a relational database that's a certain amount of code, a certain amount of no code, but I can build these things within it, and it offers a lot of flexibility within that range. But like there's certain base parameters aren't changing, and it's just like I don't know how to. I don't know what that is, or if Norbert would consider that part of the language and the techniques of cybernetics.
Well, I have a follow-up question from the affordances stuff. What happens? What's the relationship between interacting with affordances and contingency? So if we have contingency has like guides you down a certain path and limits your outcomes. If you're interacting with an affordance, does that reinforce the affordance, or does that do something to make affordance relevant, or what is the?
What do you mean by reinforce? I guess like the decision of a subject to go with one affordance over another, which may or may not be a conscious decision. Like that's definitely a place of divergence in their like psychological trajectory.
Right.
And I guess this is more general than affordances, because it gets into the point about history being definitive of your current state, like the affordances you've followed and that have effectively, you know, what's the, like, what I'm looking for a word, maybe it's just affords, but basically the what you've been afforded in the past determines where you are now to some extent.
Yeah. Well, I think, you know, the thing we're missing here is sort of reinforce. What does feedback do? It reinforces things. So if there's positive feedback, anyways, it reinforces something.
Like coupling.
If you have an interaction and particular... yes, it strengthens the coupling, perhaps, or whatever we want to call it. But that's sort of the idea of like making that current state more definitive. Because we could choose, like, we don't have to use a handle for a fork. We could use, like, well, chopsticks are kind of a handle too, but there are different ways in which we can use affordances. Different cultures use affordances differently and so forth. But those things get reinforced if you grow up in a culture and you get this dose of developmental learning that tells you to use your chopsticks instead of your knife and fork. Then that's what you do. And then, you can learn how to use a knife and fork, but it's not your first thing that you do. And so you maybe don't see it as an affordance at first. But then as you start to interact with it, you get this, it deepens this sort of trajectory that you take down that path. How do I learn more about this? Does it make sense to me? That sort of thing.
I had a very interesting. We're almost out of time, and I'm going to try to make this really fast. I had a conversation last night talking to a friend about. It's actually more about broader like life stuff in general, but I use this analogy, but quite similar to what Bradley just said, I suppose, where it's like imagine if you never imagine like a brick on the ground that you've seen, and there's like a stack of bricks or something, and like you never had the opportunity to touch it. You just kind of seen it far away, and it's like, oh, there's something there that looks like an object that you could do stuff with it, and it's like you never experienced it. You never. If anything, you may even be said, oh, the bricks aren't for you to touch. Don't worry about this. Don't even look at those things. Versus having a space or an environment or a context or support or mentoring or whatever, where you go to the brick, introduce the brick so you can do the brick, and you develop the sense of, oh, I can build the brick. I can make a patio. I can make a walkway. I can make a house. I can build on top of each other. I know the properties and the movement of it. I know the affordances, and I have a sense of agency as a user to engage, and that I know I can trust. This is a cool tie-in. I can trust that the nature and the affordances of the brick are going to be there, and that I can successfully interact with them. And I'll tie that back to Norbert's thing by saying, I guess this is the next chapter, I suppose, but it gets into this conversation about like the role of the scientist versus the role of like the chess player, and how the scientist, the laws of nature aren't changing. They give you competition, but they're not being nefarious or cunning, and that like there's this sort of static challenge that you're doing, and how that's different from maybe other things. And then I think there's some debate to have in that, I suppose, but it's an interesting way of tying to like what are you trying to do. And there's sort of this, what I was going back to what I was saying, like I'm really focused on my own life and other things, about like developing that sense of agency, that I can interact with this brick, I can do that, and realizing forces at play that are like deterring the engagement of interacting with that brick or interacting with those things. And that's a particular use case, but I think there's something, I keep going back to Amanda's words. I really liked it a lot of like the constituency thing, the ability to meet and be constituent of the message, I think is relevant. And I think we'll be getting cut off soon in a few minutes, so we should probably concluding thoughts before the recording turns off anyway. And I know we got other stuff to do, but yeah.
Looking forward to next week.
Yeah.
Or 2 weeks from now?
Yeah, 2 weeks from now. Yeah.
Hopefully
your audience is bigger.
Well, we could give them the recording and tell them to catch up.
Sure.
We didn't finish this chapter yet, so there's still maybe a few more things to cover. Right? Or did I just, no, here it is. Okay. So maybe there's a few more things to cover, or we can just, I don't know. I'll try to summarize this, I suppose, and then so we can just, do you want to just do chapter 2 next time, basically, and not do you want to like finish chapter 1 first? How do you want to do that?
We'll just finish chapter 1. Well, no, we can finish chapter 1 first. I want to unpack things as they come along. Like, we'll probably jump around anyways, because these things are kind of in different places. But again, like we did with, maybe we don't need to do it to the extent that we did with what's his name, but don't worry about Fuchs.
Yeah, I definitely want to do chapter 2 next time and keep moving, but we don't have to like exclusively talk about chapter 2.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Oh my God, yeah, 6 months on Fuchs, I think was